break here.
Right here? All right, cool. Resuming the reading of Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America by James Forman, Jr. The city council did not heed Moore's call, at least not at first. On October 8, 1975, by an 8-4 vote, it gave preliminary approval to Clark's proposal. Before it could become law, the proposal would need to be voted on a second time, per the provisions of the Home Rule Act, and then signed by the city's new mayor, Walter Washington. From Washington's desk, the bill would go to the Congressional House Committee for a 30-day waiting period. Unless Congress rejected the law, it would go into effect. Charles Diggs, one of the founders of the Congressional Black Caucus and the chair of the District Committee, did not much like Clark's bill. However, like virtually all blacks in Congress, he was deeply protective of the district's newly acquired right to self-governance. Diggs tests veto views on pot ran a Washington Post headline speaking to the congressman's ambivalence. Ultimately, though, while Diggs let the city leaders know that he did not support the law, there is no evidence to suggest that he attempted to block its passage. But others did rise up in opposition. Having failed to prevent the bill's initial approval, the city's ministers redoubled their efforts in order to thwart its final passage. This time, they made it clear that their opposition did not exist solely on the moral plane. It could have been real political efficiency, too. Indeed, the black church was among D.C.'s most powerful political constituencies. As Moore himself noted, the institution with the greatest influence over the city's votes was not among the usual suspects. It is not the Board of Trade. It is not the Democratic or Republican Party. It is not even the labor unions. Hold on. All right, that's better. Rather, he said, in a city with a weak party structure, it is the black church that has control over most people. Fowler, Hines, and the rest of the city's black clergymen claimed that the majority of D.C. citizens shared their opposition to Clark's bill. The available opinion data, though limited, supported their contention. In the midst of the City Council's deliberations in 1975, the Bureau of Social Science Research asked residents of D.C. and its suburbs whether they agreed that marijuana use should be made legal with age and other controls like those for alcohol. This was not the precise issue before the council. Clark's proposal would have kept marijuana illegal but reduced penalties to a citation and a fine. Yet the results were significant nonetheless. Released in the midst of a city council debate, they revealed that while white D.C. voters supported legalization by a hefty 14-point margin, the number for black voters were flipped. Only 43% supported legalization, with 51% opposed and 6% undecided. The clergymen worked diligently to make sure that the black opinion remained firmly in the prohibitionist camp. Before the bill's initial passage, a group of 150 ministers rallied at the district building. There, one minister had gone so far as to warn city council members now that they, the pastors, would meet them at the polls. Now, they turned up the heat, targeting Sterling Tucker, the chair of the city council. On October 21st, a group of 50 ministers ran with Tucker and asked him to table the legislation rather than allow it to come up for a final vote. The 51-year-old Tucker was an ambitious politician with a reputation for getting along with those with diverse constituencies. He headed the local chapter of the moderate, business-friendly Urban League in the 1950s and also served a brief stint in 1968 as the co-chair of the more radical Black United Front. Tucker's willingness to negotiate led to complaints that he lacked firm convictions. As a friend of his told a reporter in 1974, in a tough fight, a politician wants to know who will be on my side, and they are quite sure of him because he keeps his options open with everyone. The ministers had already proved to themselves to be a formidable constituency. In the last election, they had endorsed Mayor Washington as well as 11 of the 13 victorious candidates for city council, including Tucker himself. If he wanted to stay in office, Tucker needed to keep the votes of these ministers carried, and the survey results from the Bureau of Social Science Research indicated that those votes would not go to a politician in favor of decriminalization, especially not when the city's ministers had made it clear that they were more willing to turn black dissatisfaction into political expression. Tucker also had reason to fear that even if the bill passed, Mayor Washington would veto it. Washington had kept silent while Clark's proposal was before the council, but he had deep connections with the city's religious leaders. If Tucker had opposed the ministers only to have Washington side with them, not only would he have risked his career, but his efforts would also have come to naught. In the end, the ministers prevailed. Just hours after their meeting with Tucker, the council chair tabled the bill, an action that doomed it for the current legislative session. As of Tuesday evening, October 21st, Bill 144, the Marijuana Reform Act of 1975, was dead. Our standard accounts of the war on drugs are powerful and indispensable, but we need to supplement them in order to understand why the majority black city of Washington, D.C. remained committed to marijuana prohibition. After all, this was not a story in which a white majority, acting out of indifference or hostility to black lives, imposed tough criminal penalties that disproportionately burdened a black minority. Quite the opposite. The leaders of the decriminalization effort were white, and the only available polls suggest that white citizens largely supported Clark's bill. No, it was blacks who killed marijuana decriminalization in D.C. But why? There are a number of reasons, all of them essential to understanding the drug war's role in creating a new and racially charged system of punishment. We must never start with the fact that decriminalization's leading opponents, people like Judge Fauntleroy and Doug Moore, were among the black community's most dogged defenders. They were committed racemen, not Uncle Toms. During the formal political debates and in their public lives more generally, these leaders regarded themselves as the guardians of the black community, and especially of its young people, whom they were determined to protect from the dangers of drug use. Their opposition to decriminalization was not simply an expression of what the law professor Randall Kennedy has called the politics of respectability, the practice by which respectable blacks seek to expel the criminal element from their midst or shun them as disreputable embarrassments of the race. Instead, it illustrates what might be termed the politics of responsibility. The rising crime rates of the late 1960s, and the heroin epidemic in particular, explain why their sense of the responsibility to the black community had led them to oppose decriminalization. Heroin's rampage had taught black leaders and constituents a clear lesson in the social realities of drug use. Addiction, they had learned, could spread exponentially, and its consequences were not exclusively personal. Drug use could decimate families, schools, and even entire neighborhoods. The libertarian approach to drugs, what I put in my body is my business, would therefore find little purchase in black communities. Additionally, the specter of heroin raised the stakes of the marijuana as a gateway drug argument. Since heroin had destroyed communities so quickly, the thinking went, even the slightest risk that marijuana might lead a user to heroin was not one that policymakers could afford to take. As Reverend Andrew Fowler had cautioned the members of the D.C. Council, the young users of marijuana will easily be susceptible to the harder drugs. These youth, he warned, have no guardian but you. But if decriminalization's opponents felt responsible for the fate of black D.C., why didn't they appreciate the damage that continued criminalization would do to that very community? The answer lies in one of this book's central arguments. Mass incarceration is the result of small, distinct steps, each of whose significance becomes more apparent over time, and only when considered in light of later events. And this point is highlighted, so kind of to bring this back on at least on a local scale. And I've seen these statistics numerous times. I can't get an exact quote on who first published it, but I believe blacks and whites use drugs at the same rate. However, black users are I believe, 3 times more likely to be arrested for drug possession as opposed to their white counterparts. The decision not to decriminalize marijuana in 1975 exemplifies this phenomenon. Opponents of Clark's bill minimized the harms of criminalization by stressing that most arrestees did not end up with convictions and almost none went to prison. And as unimaginable as that sounds today, it was true at the time. Those who joined the 1975 debate were also unaware that in the years to come, criminal convictions and even arrests without convictions would lead to increasingly serious collateral consequences. In short, because D.C.'s debate over marijuana decriminalization took place before the full-scale drug war was launched, decriminalization's opponents could not foresee the eventual impact of their victory on the young blacks they were trying to save. Racial distrust was also a key factor in D.C.'s decision. The champions of marijuana reform, Judge Halleck and most importantly, David Clark, were white. Although several black city council members, including Marion Barry, who would later become the mayor of Washington, D.C., voted in favor of the bill, they were not the face of legislation or at the foreground of the debate. The racial identity of the bill's primary supporters were particularly troubling in the era of post-Home Rule politics. After living under Congress's thumb for a century, D.C. residents finally had begun to wriggle free. In their campaigns for office, many of the city's politicians had run on the platforms stressing independence from the white political establishment. Some candidates, like Doug Moore, had gone further, directly criticizing members of the black elite for refusing to stand up to white power brokers. In this context, not everyone was quite ready to believe a group of white men who claimed they were seeking to help black youth avoid the stigma of criminality. But why were whites the face of the movement? Between 1973 and 1975, D.C. police arrested more than 8,000 black people for marijuana possession. One might have expected them or their family members to serve as witnesses or public voices in the debate over decriminalization, but though they were referenced in the abstract, there were no flesh-and-blood black victims in the nascent drug war making the case for Clark's proposal. In this respect, the war against marijuana anticipated events to come. Although as the tough on crime movement gathered force, those who had been arrested or convicted rarely participated in debates over criminal justice policy in D.C. or nationally. They rarely told their stories, and their invisibility helps to explain why our criminal justice system became so punitive. And that's going to be the end of this chapter. Next chapter up is going to be gun control. On January 4th, 1975, 2 days after the mayor and city council took their oaths of office, the city's largest black paper, the Washington Afro-American, popularly known as the Afro, led with a crime story above the masthead on its front page. Pastor robbed of $1,100 at gunpoint, the headline declared. Below the masthead was a second headline: New council discusses city's future. The challenge that violent crime would pose to D.C.'s recently elected government was visible from the beginning. The pastor was Leon Lipscomb. The robbery was brazen. 2 men had interrupted his wife, Ida, as she was outside washing windows. They flashed a gun, then hustled her into the house, where they found Reverend Lipscomb. The robbers pushed the couple upstairs to their bedroom, tied them to the bed, and covered them with a blanket. Then they ransacked the house, leaving with jewelry, watches, and the $1,100 holiday bonus that Reverend Lipscomb had just received from his congregation. Lipscomb's status as a church leader made the robbery newsworthy. But the crime itself was hardly an aberration. Between 1960 and 1969, the district's murder rate tripled, attracting widespread attention from the national politicians who invoked rising crime rate in a majority black city as part of their effort to discredit both the Johnson administration and liberalism more broadly. In 1964, just as crime in D.C. began to rise, the Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater said that D.C. was the one city which should reflect most brightly the president's concern for law and order, for decent conduct. Instead, it as a city embattled, plagued by lawlessness, haunted by fears. As the historian Michael Flam points out, left unsaid but understood was Washington's image and reputation as a heavily African-American city. Goldwater's strategy was called out by the NAACP Executive Secretary Roy Wilkins, who said that every utterance touching on the issue of the crime issue by the Republican nominee and his vice presidential running mate had its ill-concealed racial overtones, undertones, and just plain out-and-out tones. Richard Nixon picked up where Goldwater left off. D.C. should not stand for disorder and crime, he declared. White conservatives weren't the only one raising the issue. The city's two leading papers, the Washington Post and the Washington Star, reported frequently on the crime crisis, with such headlines such as New Report on D.C. Crime, Profile of a Frightened City, and The Guns of D.C., Dodge City on the Potomac, the latter by a young reporter named Carl Bernstein. Although crime was concentrated in the city's poorest neighborhoods, it seemed that nobody was immune, a point made clear when Mississippi Senator John Stennis was shot during a robbery. On January 30th, 1973, Stennis was confronted at gunpoint outside his home by two young black men who took his wallet, 25 cents, and his Phi Beta Kappa key. Though he didn't resist, the young men clubbed Stennis to the ground and shot him. A senseless and sickening assault on a victim of such prominence would have earned headlines at any time, but coming when it did, a decade after rising crime and violence, it provided more than a momentary jolt. Even stalwart liberals began to reassess core principles. Writing in the Washington Star, Milton Vierst described being home alone with a few nights after the Stennis shooting. The doorbell rang, and when Vierst approached to answer, he saw two black faces. I remember trying to say to myself, baby, it looks like this is it. His fear, Vierst admitted, was based on race. If you want to call that racism, go ahead. Still, he answered the door. As it turned out, the visitors only wanted directions. Vierst's relief at surviving the encounter was matched by his sadness and anger how the Stennis assault, so random, so purposeless, so unexplainable, had changed him. Afraid to answer his own door just because the faces on the other side were black. What had happened to him? That's what rampant crime does, he concluded. While the crime crisis affected the entire city, Black D.C. was hit at the hardest. On a visit to the district in 1963, Malcolm X had identified street crime as a grave problem, and he told reporters gathered at the National Airport that he planned to launch a series of black-only meetings to examine the issue. And the problem wasn't limited to D.C. Crime was spiraling out of control in black communities across the country. In Philadelphia, murder rates nearly doubled in the 1960s. In Boston, Detroit, and New York, they more than doubled. Cleveland's more than tripled. Criminologists remain divided on the causes of the rise in crime in D.C. and nationally. Some cite the post-war baby boom. Young people commit more crimes than older ones do. Others blame the heroin epidemic, and others still point to lead emissions from automobiles. Lead poisoning is associated with impulsive behavior in young adults, and emissions rose steadily for decades before the federal government banned leaded gasoline. But, whatever the reason, the stark fact remains. D.C. had become a much more dangerous place in the 1960s, as residents witnessed the largest decade-long crime wave ever recorded, then or since. What made the crime surge so lethal, many agreed, were guns, especially handguns. In 1974, when the number of killings in D.C. set a new record, more than 60% of the 407 murders involved firearms. Indeed, gun violence had become the leading cause of death for D.C. males under the age of 40. The national trends were similar. As the murder rate spiked in the 1960s, so did numbers of homicides involving high firearms. In addition, robberies, including armed robberies, had increased since the early 1960s at a higher rate than any other crime, and by 1973, more and more of those armed robberies involved handguns instead of knives or other less lethal weapons. In the summer of 1975, as David Clark and Doug Moore were locking horns over marijuana's impact on the black community, the D.C. Council was also debating what would be the most sweeping gun control measures in any American city. As we shall see, the marijuana and gun control debates in D.C. would follow an astonishingly similar trajectory. In each case, city leaders faced a perceived threat to the black community: drug use and abuse in one case, gun violence in the other. And in each case, they faced the same question: is the criminal law the best way to respond? We do not typically think of drug policy and gun policy in similar terms. The distinction between them is reflected in our politics. Liberals generally object to anti-drug measures but favor restrictions on guns, while conservatives more normally take the opposite positions. The distinction is also reflected in our language. When we criminalize drugs, we call it a war on drugs, but when we do the same thing with guns, we name it gun control. Of course, there are good reasons to regard the issues differently, even though the most ardent drug warrior would concede that guns pose a more indirect lethal threat to public safety than does any to them. And our response to them have commonalities that we rarely acknowledge. Those commonalities would help shape the direction of American crime policy at the dawn of the era of mass incarceration. In 1975, virtually every part of the city's black community was consumed by the crime epidemic. The Afro pressed for action, launching a series of editorials urging the city leaders to make it so that crime doesn't pay. Under such headlines, why not an anti-crime drive? The paper declared, it is becoming increasingly shocking, discouraging, and frightening to the residents of the District of Columbia to turn on the radio or television or pick up the newspaper daily or weekly and learn that one of their neighbors has been a victim of a crime. The editorial was accompanied by a cartoon depicting the city's black leaders gathered around a conference table, working under black shadows labeled "Growling Crime Menace." Neighborhood newsletters took an increasingly urgent tone, pleading with residents to join the fight against crime, and to contact the local police precinct if you notice anything strange or any suspicious-looking strangers walking through the streets. A coalition of churches and neighborhood groups organized a crime prevention seminar featuring Mayor Washington. Even Howard University, with its proud history as a training ground for the black elite, was under siege. Its campus newspaper, The Hilltop, lamented that deaths and crime again greeted this year's homecoming, and ran an editorial cartoon featuring a drawing of a black man, wanted, brother for crimes against brother. 25 years before Chris Rock unleashed his famous routine complaining is between two groups. I would say I think we all know what Chris Rock routine is being referred to in this. The Hilltop made the same distinction in crime reports like this. Wednesday, October 25th, Sister Valencia Abner, a resident of Fraser Hall, was robbed of $10 by a black man holding a silver-plated .38. Crime conferences were a regular feature of campus life, including a day-long session keynoted by Alvin Toussaint, a leading black psychiatrist and author of Why Blacks Kill Blacks. Some D.C. residents fortified their homes, installing burglar bars and replacing single locks with multiple deadbolts. Others took up martial arts such as kung fu and judo. The owner of one of the city's most popular studios claimed to have trained more than 4,000 students in recent years. For those who couldn't attend a class, an Afro columnist offered readers a primer. If an attacker has you by the shoulders or throat with both hands, chances are he is not concentrating on his midsection. A sharp kick to the groin, preferably with pointed toes, proves extremely effective. Then the columnist advised, "Don't stand around to finish him off. Run like hell." Under such conditions, it is hardly surprising that many residents decided to stay home when possible. National polls showed fear of crime increasing among all segments of the population, and polls showed that it included a racial breakdown almost invariably showed blacks as more fearful than whites. In an urban league poll, 2/3 of respondents from low-income areas required that they were afraid to walk in their own neighborhoods. A commission established by Mayor Washington found that 20% of men in D.C. and an astonishing 45% of women said they never went out alone at night. But no amount of caution seemed to work. One local activist was shot in the head and killed while walking to a neighborhood association meeting to discuss fighting crime. A crime researcher was robbed at gunpoint while walking to Capitol Hill to present his findings to a Senate committee. A 14-year-old boy named Kenneth Washington was killed by a stray bullet as he rode in a Washington Post truck delivering the morning paper. Even church-going was no longer safe, as worshippers discovered when purse snatchers began targeting them as they walked home from services. When the Afro declared that it was time to end this self-destruction and that we must begin to make things hot for would-be criminals, few could be found who disagreed. John Wilson had not campaigned for public office as a crime fighter. Born in 1943 in the tiny town of Prince Anne on Maryland's rural eastern shore, Wilson had been raised by his grandparents. By high school, he had grown into a funny, handsome basketball star, more interested in romance than in studying. In his yearbook, he asked to be remembered for his way with the girls. Wilson entered college in 1961, but books couldn't match the urgency of the civil rights movement, and he soon left to join the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee. SNCC was considered the most aggressive of the major organizations working in the South. As former President Jimmy Carter, a Georgia native, once said, if you wanted to scare white people in southwest Georgia, Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference wouldn't do it. You had to say one word, SNCC. Wilson fit right in, and during the mid-1960s he traveled from Maryland to the Deep South, where he registered voters, organized sit-ins, and was arrested many times. In 1969, Wilson did what fellow activists like Doug Moore, Stokely Carmichael, and Marion Barry had done a few years earlier. He moved to Washington, D.C., a place Jet magazine called one of the next urban meccas for civil rights refugees. And in 1973, when the Home Rule Act set the stage for an elected city council, Wilson faced a choice common to movement veterans. Having won the right to vote, hold office, should they join a system or continue to press for change from the outside? Calling himself a realist, Wilson chose the inside track. At 31 years old, he ran for office in Ward 2, the city's most racially and economically diverse district, and won. But Wilson couldn't avoid the issue of crime. Nor did he want to. After Kenneth Washington was killed delivering the paper, Wilson kept a copy of the news story nearby. Like his fellow council members, he belonged to a class of black elected officials emerging nationwide. Their candidates were premised on the notion that they would be different from the white politicians who came before them. No longer would the concerns of black citizens fall on deaf ears. No longer would the police refuse to enter black neighborhoods. As the NAACP Roy Wilkins recalled from his childhood in Kansas City, the police took the view that there's one more Negro killed, the more of them dead, the less to bother us. Gone were the days when one black man could kill another and receive a pardon on the grounds that this is the case of one Negro killing another. The old familiar song, hot supper, liquor, dead Negro. John Wilson needed an answer to the crime crisis, and gun control was the logical choice. By modern standards, his proposal was absurdly ambitious. If you raise the topic of gun control over dinner today, most people will think you mean tighter background checks, smaller ammunition clips, and restricted access for people with mental illness. But things were quite different 40 years ago, and Wilson's proposal indicates just how much has changed. The council members wanted to ban the sale, purchase, and possession of all handguns and shotguns in the city. Current gun owners would be obligated to turn in their weapons, and anyone who failed to do so would possibly face prison time for a first conviction and mandatory prison term for a second. As Wilson explains, people think I want to take everybody's gun away, and they're perfectly right. Wilson offered his gun control in the same year that David Clark was pressing for marijuana decriminalization. Both legislators argued that their proposals would help blacks most of all, but compared with Clark, Wilson had an important advantage: the vocal support of black crime victims. On April 4th, 1975, 7 years to the day after Martin Luther King's assassination, Richard Ware, recently retired after a long career with the State Department, woke up to a parent's worst nightmare, a call informing him that his son was dead. Richard Ware III, an assistant manager at Four Guys Grocery on Alabama Avenue, had been on his way to the bank to deposit the store's cash from the day. Before he could get there, two armed men demanded his money. When he hesitated, they shot and killed him. Some parents turn inward after such a tragedy. For Ware, it was a call to action. Just 2 months after his son's death, he and his wife began circulating a petition demanding that the mayor and the city council take action to halt the slaughter in our streets. When a city council committee held a public hearing on Wilson's gun control legislation, Ware was among those who testified. "Let's put things first," he said. "My family wants to live free of fear, free to walk the streets without concern about who is in front of or behind us." Ware reported that more and more of his friends were afraid to go outside, even in the middle of the day. The racial dimension of the city's gun violence was especially troubling to him. As he pointed out, both him and his son's murderers were black, and this was hardly unusual. At the time of Ware's murder, 85% of those killed by guns in the District of Columbia were black, and so were a similar percentage of murder subjects. Violence within the black community, both in D.C. and across the country, was taking a horrifying toll. Nationally, the black homicide rate was 7 to 11 times higher than the white homicide rate. How, Ware asked, could this be happening now? Under slogans like Black Pride and Black is Beautiful, many African Americans in the late 1960s and early 1970s had begun celebrating the black aesthetic, black culture, and black solidarity. It is ironic, Ware lamented, that as black men have more frequently called with each other brother, there has been an increase in black killing black. Ware was not the only one to make the bitter irony, as a cartoon from Ebony magazine indicates. Note the poster advertising a James Brown concert. His song "Say It Loud" on Black and Proud had become one of the anthems of the Black Pride movement. For Ware and Wilson, reducing the number of guns in circulation was critical to bringing safety to the city streets. All of this terror, Ware said, is caused by the man with the gun. We must fight him or die. The key to overcoming him is simple. Take his gun. He is nothing without his gun. Victims like Ware had an important ally, the black church. As we have seen, D.C.'s black religious leaders were effective opponents in marijuana decriminalization. Although organized church groups did not take a stand in the gun control debate, individual ministers played important roles, none more so than Reverend Walter Fauntroy. The pastor of the New Bethel Baptist Church, Fauntroy had become D.C.'s first elected representative to Congress in 1971. Gun control was one of the signature issues in the House. On the local level, he was a lead witness in favor of D.C.'s legislation. Testifying before the D.C. City Council, Fauntroy said he was tired of handgun funerals. Guns, he said, had not only taken the lives of national heroes like Martin Luther King, but also those of countless others whose names had already been forgotten. Fauntroy emphasized that the issue was not simply an abstraction for him. As a minister and activist in the civil rights movement, I have officiated at the funerals of numerous citizens who would be alive today had we had a law banning the manufacture, sale, and possession of handguns. Fauntroy hoped that the prohibition would change how Americans, especially the city's youth, viewed guns. From Wyatt Earp to The Godfather, we mislead our young people who think they can secure their manhood through the barrel of the gun. That's unfortunately a sensitive topic. I've lost a lot of friends who became just enamored with the idea of having a gun and just lost sight of themselves. And I feel as if American culture just emphasizes the idea of that guns are equivalent to masculinity, and that's just a horrible idea to have a comparison to, and it's also just a very toxic mindset to have in a culture. Like, it seems to be like America has like a culture of violence around it when it comes to particularly handguns. Other ministers joined Fauntroy in their use of personal experiences to advocate for gun restrictions. Reverend Stanford Harris of Capitol Hill's Ebenezer United Methodist Church told the council that he spoke on behalf of a coalition of ministers, at least two of whom have had guns pointed at their faces and bodies. He also spoke for his congregation, which included many senior citizens who have suffered the trauma and fear of assaults with handguns. Finally, Reverend Harris said he spoke for himself. He, too, had lost a son to gun violence. He told the council that of the utter despair and continuing psychic pain brought to my early family that when our 22-year-old son had his brains brutally torn to pieces by a handgun in the hands of another young man. And in this one, a harder edge, the mandatory minimums. Alongside empathy for Reverend Harris and other victims' relatives by outrage at those who pulled I apologize for the moment. We just heard sirens. The anger found its political expression in the demand for tougher gun criminal penalties, especially for any crime involving guns. Fauntroy proposed that anybody caught selling a gun would face a mandatory 5-year sentence, while those convicted of illegal possession would face up to 2 years. This was not tough enough for John Wilson, who felt that mandatory minimum sentences were required. The current sentencing laws, as he complained, were largely disobeyed and ignored by the judges and prosecutors. According to U.S. Attorney Earl Silbert, only 7.6% of those convicted of illegal gun possession in 1974 had received jail time. The rest had received suspended sentences, probation, or fines. The Washington Post's William Raspberry seconded Silbert's criticism, complaining about a D.C. judge who imposed jail time in only 1 out of 73 gun cases to which a defendant had been convicted of a gun offense. This needed change, said Wilson, who hoped to force judges to impose prison time. He also wanted to strip prosecutors of the abilities to plea bargain in gun cases. As he put it, under his proposal, people would know that if caught with a gun, they will have to serve 10 to 12 months, no ifs, ands, or buts. Wilson's accusation that judges and prosecutors were disobeying the law in one sense was unfair. Discretion is built into every part of the criminal justice system, and the judges and prosecutors do nothing wrong when they seek or impose something less than the maximum. But whatever its merits, Wilson's complaint was growing ever more common in the 1970s, and his solution exemplified what was becoming the standard response in the American criminal justice. When you want to stop people from doing something, take away discretion and impose more prison time. The racial impact of such proposals was obvious. Nobody doubted that blacks would be the ones locked up. Wilson acknowledged as much, saying anyone who has been to court knows that at least 95% of the people arrested for carrying a deadly weapon are black. But as he was prepared to pay the price, in an open letter to other city leaders, he stressed that the criminal element was a minority victimizing the majority. We must begin to realize that a very large majority of residents of this city are being terrorized by a small group of people who have no respect for anyone. Though few in numbers, the group presented a huge threat. Left unchecked, Wilson said, the criminal element will limit our mobility, our safety, our economic and social growth. He was aware that his tough stance might be construed as anti-black. The comedian activist Dick Gregory, for example, had recently said that crime in the streets was America's new way of saying the N-word, in language that would have made Richard Nixon or Barry Goldwater proud. Wilson offered his rejoinder. Respect for law can no longer be considered code words for bigotry. Wilson wasn't alone. After a 3-day conference on black crime at Howard University, the Afro editorialized the toughness was in the order. Reflecting on the city's rapid deterioration, peaceful and safe and agreeable areas had been radically transformed into an environment of fear and fright. The paper concluded that the courts and judges should take harsher views on the convicted offenders and mete out tough and long-time sentences. It was the only way, said the editors, to stop this small minority of criminal elements from its path of destruction. Would you like to take over? No. Okay. Was he up? We all good with the? Yeah. Okay. Cool. I had to pause first. I paused for a second when I heard that. I probably got to. I think I'm thinking a couple more pages before I tap out for the night. Even with this tough talk, gun control advocates knew that there were limits to what D.C. or any city could do to keep guns off the streets. As Fontroy admitted, even strict enforcement would hardly make a dent of the problem, because of the heart of the matter is that in the thousands of guns that came pouring into the district every month, from control-free havens in North Carolina, South Carolina, and elsewhere. Still, supporters of Wilson's legislation persevered, for which they saw themselves as the vanguard of a national movement. During Fontroy's testimony, Clark told him, I felt that decisive action by the city council of our nation's capital will, I think, start the momentum in the nation for a sane handgun control policy. Richard Ware shared Clark's belief Sorry, I apologize. Shared Clark's belief that others were paying attention to D.C., especially Ware thought other blacks, he said. To a black man, the city of Washington is a significant symbol. As the one major city in the U.S. with a majority black population and elected government with a black majority, what happens in D.C. is watched by all USA blacks and non-blacks alike. Gun control supporters had reason for optimism. Opinion polls showed growing public support for firearm restrictions, especially after the assassination of John and Robert Kennedy in the 1960s. African American public opinion on gun control was shifting rapidly too, and black elected officials around the country had begun to champion gun control initiatives. The two leading advocates from the black political class were Atlanta Mayor Maynard Jackson and Detroit-based Congressman John Conyers. Their motivations paralleled those of Wilson and his colleagues in D.C. Atlanta had earned the bleak delegation of the nation's murder capital, and Detroit was right behind it. As Jackson told the Atlanta Daily World, the city's leading black paper, we are living in an armed camp, an illegally armed camp. It is my job to stop the killing. Calling gun control as his most urgent priority, Conyers used his position as chair of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime to push a legislative package that included a ban on handguns. Testifying before Conyers' subcommittee, Jackson described the burden of being the chief black official in a city where so many blacks were being shot. The black-on-black homicide rate is one of the worst disgraces we have in the country, he told Conyers. Jackson ultimately grounded his argument in an appeal for racial empathy. I, as a black man and a black American, and as the mayor of this black city, plead with you on behalf of all Atlantans, black or white, to do something please do it now. Jackson's rhetoric, however, obscured one significant fact about gun crime. It wasn't equally distributed throughout black America. Rather, it was concentrated among the poorest blacks, who were forced into living conditions that generated violence. Few black Americans would disagree with the Detroit psychologist who said, in 1973, living in a frustrating, stress-inducing environment like a ghetto every day of your life makes many people walking powder kegs. This understanding led subcommunity leaders to insist that gun control would not succeed because it failed to address crime's root causes. In Chicago, Reverend Russ Meek, and a black anti-gun control activist, countered Conyers' proposal by arguing that Congress should attack the social causes of crime and not the ownership of weapons. It bears emphasis that black supporters of gun control like Jackson acknowledged that the social causes of crime and insisted they had not abandoned the struggle against equality and racial injustice. But they also argued that restricting guns was a useful step, even if it didn't solve the entire problem. Black Americans are economically oppressed, Jackson said in his congressional testimony. But while we address that, while we fight with all that we have for a fair shake for Americans, all Americans, including black Americans, in housing and employment and the delivery of health service. While we are doing this, we must address an additional problem of the presence of handguns. Irma Henderson, the first black woman on Detroit's City Council, also supported Conyers' proposal, but insisted that it must be part of a larger effort to improve conditions in black communities. If we do not ease the tension of racism and economic disaster, she warned, gun control laws will not work. In the D.C. Council, Wilson wanted to be ready for the root causes argument. To prepare for his committee's public hearing, he drew up a list of possible objections to gun restrictions, followed by what he planned to say in response. Under the heading, Gun controls do not attack the root social and economic causes of crime. Wilson wrote, of course they don't, but they will reduce the effects of crime. And D.C.'s black citizens, Wilson thought, couldn't wait for America to address root causes. As he said in his prepared response, waiting until society solved its root social and economic problems, when right now we can reduce the loss of life, the bodily harm and the loss of property that results from crime and accident, makes no sense. One of its many editorials endorsing gun control, the Afro commended Wilson's approach. From every time the subject of high crime comes up, there are those who blame racism, oppression, poverty, self-hatred, discrimination, and joblessness, the paper noted. Of course, all of these things play a part in the crime picture, and we are never going to rid the cities of crime to any substantial degree until those annoying conditions and the forces that create them are improved or corrected. And yet, the editors concluded, if a gun control bill will help, then let's have a gun control bill, and let's have it as soon as possible. And that's where I'm going to end. I'm going to end my reading for the day. Please tune in. We should either be going back live relatively momentarily, and if not latest in the morning. This is Brendan Rabbit, and I'm signing off.